Hey folks, insects like you and I are heterotrophs. That is, they cannot make their own energy. That is, they can't make their own energy sources insects like you and I are heterotrophs. That is, they can't make their own energy sources like some organisms can. Organisms like plants and algae can utilize the energy of the sun. They store it into complex molecules where the carbon bonds contain the energy. Organisms such as plants and algae can utilize the energy of the sun to store it in the chemical bonds of carbon containing molecules. And these organisms are called autotrophs. We're heterotrophs. Insects, therefore, need to go out into the environment and gather these resources, this energy, in order to fulfill some of their basic needs to maintain homeostasis, to build new tissues, to grow, to move in the environment, to capture more resources, to extract nutrients without getting poisoned in the process, to develop eggs, and so on. The dietary requirements of all insects include carbohydrates, amino acids, cholesterol, B vitamins, a series of inorganic nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sodium, and so on. And for the most part, for insects, getting macronutrients is really what's prioritized over these smaller micronutrients. So clearly, insects need energy, and most of this comes in the form of carbohydrates. And they need to build their tissues, and they need to build proteins within their own tissues. And to do this, you need amino acids. So carbon-containing molecules and nitrogen-containing molecules are really some of the key. So carbon-containing molecules and nitrogen-containing molecules are really some of the key structural components that insects need. And we'll talk about some others later on today. It turns out, for the most part, for organisms feeding on autotrophs, feeding on plants or algae, like herbivorous insects, which are the majority of the insects that are out there, there's usually plenty of carbon to go around. This is not the case for below ground organisms like microbes, where actually carbon can be limiting. In contrast, one of the key limiting resources is nitrogen. So the questions that we're going to address today are: what are some of the main nutritional constraints facing insects? And how do insects obtain enough nutrients to survive? Historically, the study of insect nutrition has focused on trying to figure out how material that comes in translates into how much biomass insects actually gain. And something can be learned about the efficiencies or inefficiencies by which this actually happens. And there was a very large field of study in insect nutrition that tried to figure out how to actually do this. And I'm just going to list some of these definitions here, simple calculations that were basically done by measuring how much biomass an insect gains over a certain amount of time, how much biomass is actually ingested, how much comes into the insect, how much comes out that's not processed, that's been that comes out as feces or undigested biomass, what the difference between these two is. This is basically the assimilated biomass, all the biomass that went in that didn't go back out the back end. And biomass that was assimilated and metabolized, that is actually kind of blown off as respiration. And you can calculate all kinds of indices that tell you something about, relatively speaking, how did insects actually do when they ate certain materials. And you can calculate things like the relative growth rate here, and you can just look at these equations and kind of figure out what they are. The approximate digestibility of the material that they're actually eating, how efficient they were at converting this food, how efficient of the digested food versus the ingested food. There's a difference between that actually stays in versus all of that actually just kind of goes through. And the various relationships between the relative consumption rate, that's RCR, versus the efficiency of conversion index here. So relative growth rate is the biomass over the average so the relative growth rate is calculated by the biomass over a certain period of time versus the relative consumption rate, which is how much is ingested over a certain period of time, and so on. And the only reason I'm giving you these right now is that you're going to encounter them in the literature, you're going to encounter them in your textbook, and they're helpful for understanding how do insects actually perform as they take in different kinds of food, or as they're useful for understanding how insects perform when they eat food. So here's an example of some early studies that actually looked at some relationships between these things, like the assimilation efficiency here for different insects. This is a bug, and this is a sawfly, I believe. The relative growth efficiency, this is the relative growth rate, as a function of some features of the food, in particular nitrogen. Nitrogen is going to be a kind of a key, and nitrogen is actually going to be one of the key things that we as entomologists focus on for some obvious reasons. And as you can see here, as the percent of nitrogen in the plant material increases, almost linearly, the ability to take in that material and convert it into some biomass also increases. So insects are able to feed more efficiently here. Oh, I said these were sawflies. These are chrysomelids. These are leaf beetles here. There's a positive but kind of saturating relationship for these beetles between nitrogen and consumption rates and growth efficiency. So generally, the more nitrogen you get, the better you are at actually converting that food into your own biomass. Here's another relationship between how much nitrogen protein is. Here's another relationship between nitrogen-containing compounds, proteins in particular, and attributes of insects like body size. The more nitrogen there is in plant materials for these sap-feeding insects, the delphasids that you met last week, the bigger their body size. And the bigger the body size, the more eggs that females can actually lay. This is a very common relationship with a lot of insects. The bigger you are, the more eggs you can lay. So nitrogen translates into fecundity. So this is a reproductive output. And you can imagine that that's going to have some effects on the population growth rate. If your individuals are laying more eggs, then the number of individuals that are joining the population are going to be higher under conditions of higher nitrogen. And in fact, this is what we see for areas in salt marshes where plants that had lower percent nitrogen in their leaf tissues tended to have lower densities of the plant hoppers compared to areas that had higher amount of nitrogen in their leaf tissues, that had twice, 3 times the amount of plant hoppers that are actually there. Here's another relationship between nitrogen-containing compounds, proteins, and in fact, proteins, you can just very quickly calculate the protein content by taking nitrogen and multiply it by 6.25 here. You find that the relationship between protein content, again, nitrogen content, and survivorship also it can be very tightly coupled. This is the case for a arctiid moth, a tiger moth, feeding on its host plants here. What's interesting is that we also see patterns of abundance as the patterns of nitrogen fluctuate within plants. So let's take a look at these tree-feeding aphids, the sycamore aphids. And sycamore aphids tend to reproduce most rapidly here at times when the nitrogen concentration in their host plants is also higher. As the nitrogen concentration flattens out during the middle of the summer here, as the leaves go from these rapidly expanding, growing leaves that have high nitrogen to these more tough and mature leaves, the nitrogen concentration drops off, and we also see that aphid reproduction on those plants tends to be lowest. Now, what's interesting here is that as the leaves begin to senesce, there is a physiological conversion of a lot of that nitrogen within the leaves that actually makes it more accessible by the aphids. And again, late in the season, we see an increase in the growth rates of aphids. So here we see a tracking of nitrogen availability by an herbivore that mirrors the availability of nitrogen in the plants. So what you can gather from this initial part is that nitrogen is a growth-limiting resource for the majority of insects. And that's because nitrogen plays a central metabolic role. And that's because nitrogen plays a central role in just about all key metabolic processes. And that's because the key engines of what happens within our cells, proteins, are made out of amino acids, and the key molecule within the amino acids is nitrogen. So without nitrogen, you can't build proteins. And without proteins, cells can't build themselves, and basically nothing really works within an organism. And increasing the amount of nitrogen often increases the growth, the reproduction, and survivorship of insects. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here because nitrogen is one of the most abundant atoms that we find in our biosphere. 78% of all atoms out there are nitrogen. So how can it possibly be limiting? Well, most of the nitrogen that's out there is actually in the form of nitrogen inert N2 gas. It's inert, and it doesn't react and cannot be captured by most organisms. There's some microbes that actually do this quite well, and they're incredibly important. So only a fraction of a percent, 0.05% of nitrogen is actually combined with other compounds, which is what makes them available for most organisms. So of this tiny little fraction here, half of them are part of organic molecules and half of them are part of inorganic molecules. So inorganic nitrogen is things like nitrate, nitrite. Organic molecules are things like amino acids. And so what's available to insects is only this small fraction here. They can't really use inorganic nitrogen. So only one small fraction here of only the small fraction here of nitrogen contained within organic molecules. It's what's available to insects. A very small amount. When you look at the distribution of nitrogen across different organisms when you look at the distribution of nitrogen in the biosphere here, in the available forms that organisms can use, you'll find that things like the sap that plants have in the form of xylem, this is the aqueous material that is brought up from the roots and moves up into the leaves, is actually very low in nitrogen, 0.1% at its highest, but much lower than that. So not very rich in nitrogen. Phloem, on the other hand, this is the juice of the plants that comes down from the leaves and moves back down into storage organs and into the roots. The phloem can have a little bit more concentration of nitrogen. If you look at things like leaves of evergreens or of flowering plants, you see that the concentration can get up to 3 to 4%, particularly for angiosperms. It's a little bit higher in some seeds, whereas most animals are out here in the 10 to 13% nitrogen. So these organisms here have to figure out how to get this nitrogen, given that they may feed on resources that might actually be quite low in nitrogen compared to what they have in them. And this creates one of the central challenges for most terrestrial organisms. That is, that the resources that they feed on, which may be quite low in nitrogen, don't match what their needs are, the tissue concentration that they have within their own bodies. So for herbivorous insects that are at around 10% nitrogen, their plants are at around 2% nitrogen. There's a 5-fold difference in the nitrogen, and this creates a challenge for insects. So herbivores are again here around 12. Herbivores are here around 9 to 10%. Predatory insects, on the other hand, might be 11, 12, even 13%. So this is a big mismatch between what plants are. So you would think that if insects could just take in more foods with nitrogen in them, then this should be good. Well, clearly, and those are the relationships that I showed earlier. Now, it's not that simple, as you can imagine. Nitrogen must be available in the right forms in order for them to actually be usable for insects. So it's not just being organic nitrogen that matters. They also, for example, need to be represented in amino acids, in the types of amino acids that insects can use. So here's an example, an oldie but goodie example, where as the amount of soluble nitrogen increases in the leaves of host plants, the reproductive rate, the fecundity of these aphids is positive for some aphids here, like green peach aphids, but actually is kind of flat and non-responsive for cabbage aphids. And that's because percent nitrogen is not a good representation of what's really available for the aphids that are feeding there. So the nitrogen needs to be in the right forms in order for it to be usable by insects. And in fact, sometimes nitrogen is correlated with things like chemicals that are toxic to insects. There have been studies that have been done where you can actually fertilize trees, increase the nitrogen concentration of their tissues, but that nitrogen is actually converted into compounds that are actually toxic or that are actually toxic to insects. Like in this case here, sorghum fertilized with nitrogen. A lot of that nitrogen is put into hydrogen cyanide or prussic acid, which is a compound that's toxic to some insects. Plants in the Solanaceae are things like nightshades and tomatoes and eggplants. When they're fertilized with nitrogen, you see an increase in a group of compounds called alkaloids. Alkaloids are things that affect the nervous system. We're going to learn more about that in one of the next sessions when we talk about the ways that plants defend themselves against insects. So just counting up nitrogen is not really sufficient. It needs to be in the right form, and that's one of the important things that I want you to take home from this.